Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our special program today. We're delighted to be able to welcome Kostya Kennedy speaking about his book, True, The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. We're waiting till everyone has an opportunity to log in. Remember, it's the usual things from our Zoom setup at the Pasadena Public Library. Please mute yourself. Kostya will answer questions. Please put them in chat. Today's program is being recorded, thanks to Kostya. It will be available on YouTube Pasadena Library about 5 days after the program. I've also enabled live transcript so that you can see the transcript. You must enable that yourself on your computer. So today, Kostya is coming from us a very special baseball place from Cooperstown, New York, where he's going to be making a special presentation about his book, True, tomorrow. So before we get started, I'm going to be asking him some questions, and why and how did he pick the 4 seasons of Jackie Robinson, and how did he get interested in baseball? So I hope you'll take the time throughout the program to think of your chat questions, because Kostya will answer any questions that you have related to the book. And I understand that he's also extremely knowledgeable about all sorts of things to do with baseball. And of course, you know, this is a very special time for Los Angeles because next week will be the All-Star baseball game at the Dodgers Stadium. And I understand that they are setting up in their museum their special displays about Jackie Robinson. So I want to tell you a little bit about our author. The story in True started in 1946, Robinson's first year playing in the essentially all-white minor leagues for the Montreal Royals. The book then goes on to relate how Jackie Robinson won the Most Valuable Player 1949 in his 3rd season as a Brooklyn Dodger. Through 1956, his final season in Major League Baseball, when he played valiantly despite his increasing health struggles, and 1972, the year of his untimely death. Through it all, Robinson remained true to the effort and the mission, true to his convictions and contradictions, Kennedy writes. Kennedy is also the author of the award-winning 56 Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, as well as Pete Rose and American Dilemma. Both were New York Times bestsellers and each received the Casey Award as Best Baseball Book of their respective year. Kennedy's 2016 book, Lasting Impact, One Team, One Season, What Happens When Our Sons Play Football, followed a season of high school football. Kennedy earned an MS from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, from which he received a Pulitzer Fellowship. He's taught in the Graduate Journalism program at Columbia and at NYU in the journalism department, and at the Preston Robert Tisch Institute of Global Sport. And we are honored to be able to welcome Kostya to Pasadena Public Library to tell us about how and why he wrote the book and how he got so involved in baseball. Thank you very much for coming today, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that lovely introduction, and it's great to be here with you and everyone in our audience. It's very fortuitous. I'm pleased that I'm checking in from Cooperstown. No better place to be. That's just how it worked out. So the book True, and here it is. The 4th season of Jackie Robinson. You alluded to the 4th season. So just a little background. I'd covered baseball for a long time at Sports Illustrated and other places. Baseball has been a part of my life, and had written the previous books, as you mentioned. In about 2012, 2013, I wrote a pretty long story for Sports Illustrated on Rachel Robinson, Jackie's widow, who is about to turn 100 and is still with us. And at that time, she was very active still in the Jackie Robinson Foundation, really a remarkable figure. And I'd always had an interest in and an understanding of, I grew up in New York, and always had an interest in Jackie Robinson, and doing that story on Rachel and subsequently doing some events with their daughter Sharon and their son David Robinson, both of whom I spent time with professionally over the years, began to make me see and think that there was a new way to look at Robinson and how he might be relevant and important to people today in many different ways. The idea for the 4 seasons, so they are the 4 seasons that you mentioned, 46, 49, 56, which are baseball seasons. 46, he's in the minor leagues in Montreal. 49 and 56, he's playing in the major leagues. And the final season, he's no longer a baseball player, but it's the last year of his life, but also a year when he was extremely continued to be very active in civil rights and in economic empowerment, a lot of the things that he did post-career. They're also metaphorically the spring, summer, autumn, and winter of Robinson's public and professional public life, athletic life. And so I wanted to make sure to choose some times that were distinct, that you were seeing him. In 46, you do see him in sort of the springtime of his life at that time. He'd been a famous athlete, and many of you from Pasadena and from the Los Angeles area will know that he started in high school and at Pasadena Junior College, and later at UCLA. He was a 4-sport athlete. He was an excellent football player, basketball player. Would have played track, would have run track in the 1940 Olympics almost certainly had they been held. His brother Mac finished second to Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. So he's a known and extremely accomplished athlete, but he was really a very young baseball player, relatively new to the game, having only played briefly in the Negro Leagues before 1946. And we see him that year sort of on the cusp of it all, as a baseball player and simply as a public entity. He was getting used to the idea of being Jackie Robinson, doing this incredible thing of playing as a Black man in an all-white league for a brief period of time. In 1946, he had a Black teammate on the Montreal Royals, but for most of the year, he was entirely alone and living, of course, with his wife Rachel. And it was sort of the two of them in this enclave, a French-speaking enclave in Montreal. It had a lot of appeal to me that year. I felt and discovered that it had been quite underreported. And I also knew from speaking with Rachel how crucial that year was to sort of set them up for all that was to come, all the I guess the pressure and the expectations and on all the demands that would have come in their later life. And the summer year of 1949, that's when Robinson, and this sometimes I think it gets a little forgotten or overlooked. That year he was the best baseball player alive, and the most famous athlete alive. Just an absolutely dominant player, figure, still just not really slipping the bounds into politics and into things outside the game in that way, but obviously a figure of great social movement because of what he was doing. So that's really the summer of his life. And then we see him in 1956, the autumn, as you alluded, that was his last year when diabetes was diagnosed in him shortly after that season. So it's almost certain that he had early signs of it at that time, and struggled a lot with his health, but sort of had this really valiant, strong final season, and quite moving getting involved in it, and also watching him sort of position himself for that transitional time. By 56, he'd already spent time with Dr. King. He'd become involved in the movement in many ways, and was sort of looking to transition into the next phase of his life. By 1972, when we see him, he had been, Robinson, after retiring, was not in baseball at all for 15 years until his death. He basically didn't go back into a baseball stadium. He never had a job in baseball. He didn't embrace the sport. They didn't embrace him. It wasn't an estrangement. And when he was elected right here in Cooperstown to the Hall of Fame in 1962, he thanked baseball. There's a large crowd from Major League Baseball there with him, and all good feelings in that sense, but he never sort of adhered to the establishment after leaving the game. And in 72, among other things, was the year that he was sort of repatriated into the game, in large part through Don Newcomb, who was a friend of his and a teammate in Brooklyn, who was one of the very few African Americans who had a job in baseball at that time. That was one of the things that really bothered Jackie Robinson, was how little opportunity former Black athletes and African American talent in general was getting in the front offices of Major League Baseball. But Newcomb did have a job with the Dodgers, and through him and Peter O'Malley, who was then the president, had taken over for Walter in Los Angeles, they brought Jackie out to an old timers weekend in July of 1972, so 50 years ago, basically to this day. And that was his sort of re-engaging with the game, and he was very active right up until the time of his death. Robinson was an extremely persistent person, involved, as I mentioned, in political and social causes, but also very involved on the ground. And he started an African-American bank in Harlem. In the year of his death, they broke ground on a housing development. He was extremely, he was not idle, and neither was his wife. And they lived in Stamford, Connecticut, and were extremely active in what they did. So those 4 years provided a framework, and they enabled me to sort of discover a new sides and new aspects of Robinson, to look at him. I wasn't really interested in doing a cradle to grave biography. Those have been done, and has been very good work on Robinson in the past, but it wasn't what appealed to me necessarily to do. I wanted to see him in more distinct ways. There's a series of films that maybe some of you know. It's called 7 Up, and then it became 14 Up, 21 Up. I think they're at the level of 63 Up now. And what it is, it's made by a filmmaker, the late filmmaker, but Michael Apted, British, who looked at a cohort of 7-year-old kids in England at age 7, and basically just showed you their life, what they were doing and going about their life as 7-year-olds, and then came back 7 years later, and we see them at 14, and then 7 years later, we see them at 21. And it's a fascinating way to see people's lives, and to see how some people have much more success and some people have less success, and there's great pleasure and great pain in their lives over the years. So that parameter was a bit of an inspiration to me in terms of how I wanted to approach this book. So that's really the overall look at True, the 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. Innumerable things I sort of uncovered along the way, and very happy to sort of to talk more about what I've talked about, or answer any other particular questions that people may have, or other aspects. I don't know if you have anything there, Christine, or if there's something in the chat to pass along.
There's nothing in the chat yet. I encourage everyone and all of our attendees to put your questions in chat, because Kostya will answer them. So you talk about these 4 special years that you selected in Jackie's life. So tell us a little bit about his family background, or his first 7 years that made him do all of these wonderful things after he left baseball, and also to survive some of the difficult part of the racial problems that was going on that he experienced while he was a baseball player?
No, it's a very good question. I think of relevance to all of you, or where we are now, and so to speak, virtually, or I'm virtually there with you in Southern California. The fact that he grew up, and Rachel, his wife, grew up in Pasadena and Los Angeles, as opposed to the American South, was a very important part of why he ended up having the opportunity that he had, and helped him. He played sports with white athletes as a kid and as a college athlete, and so therefore it was not as harsh of a break for him when he began doing that later as a professional. He was born in Georgia, in Cairo, Georgia. It's spelled like Cairo, like Egypt, but it's pronounced Cairo, Georgia. But only lived there for a short period of time. When he was just a baby, his father had left the family, and his mother took Jackie and his siblings out to Pasadena. They lived on Pepper Street. And he was always a really good athlete, and continued to pursue that. When Rachel, through athletics, he did get some exposure to segregation, more codified segregation, because he traveled to the South a little bit here and there. Rachel had never seen that. And when they first went to spring training in 1946 with the Dodgers, and they landed in Florida, there was a whites only bathroom, which Rachel had never seen. So what she did was immediately go up and go into it, and then take a drink out of the whites only water fountain. So she wasn't having any of it. But so it just tells you a little bit of that background. It's different. A lot of the second wave of African American players were from the South, and that made it just a little bit of a different adjustment, or a different background than Jackie had.
So thank you very much. So we have several questions. There was one question about just before Pearl Harbor, so it possibly would be December the 6th, 1941. Jackie was in the Army, and he was on a ship heading out from Pearl Harbor. Is that a fact, or is that just a rumor?
No, so he, I think it may be two stories that are getting a little bit combined there. He was in the Army, and he, interestingly, in the Army, he was in Fort Hood. He was in Texas, and just an aside, so he never saw combat. He just stayed. He was in Fort Riley in Kansas, and in Fort Hood in Texas, and he became a second lieutenant. But during the time in Fort Hood, he was on an Army intra-base bus, and he was sitting next to a woman who was a friend of his, who was an African-American woman, but presented as white, or the bus driver thought that she was white, and asked Robinson to get up and leave and go to the back of the bus and not sit with her. And Robinson didn't do it. Very, of course, echoes the Rosa Parks story, and ended up getting a court-martial, completely bogus, which was then dismissed. But he suffered that indignity. And what's important to note is that Robinson knew that he did not have to go to the back of the bus. Forget the moral. There was no moral impetus, obviously, to go to the back of the bus, but also at that time, there was no legal jurisdiction there. When you're in the Army on an intra-base bus, there was no mechanism that said, unlike the laws that did exist throughout much of the American South, sadly then, that said he would have to go to the back of the bus. And Robinson, for all his disruption, was actually a rule follower. And so he said, nope, I don't have to get up. You can't tell me to get up. And so that was an important part of his time in the Army. The story, I think, perhaps, and maybe there's another that I don't know, but from the Army, is that when Buck O'Neill, who was a famous Negro Leagues player and manager, was on a ship when later on, when Jackie signed in 45. So before he'd broken in, when he first signed the contract, and news came out to the ship in the ocean, in the Pacific, and they all celebrated that news. And that's how far, it always gives a sense of how far the reach was. I say all that, perhaps there's something else known that I don't know, and I'm certainly always look to get more information if somebody had an opportunity to shed further light on that. I do want to ask, there's a couple of questions about his decision to go to UCLA. I mean, I think it really came down to he was recruited by UCLA. They not that he couldn't have thrived at USC. UCLA made it a point to get interested in Jackie Robinson, gave him a chance to come there. He was given he earned, but they had a spot for him in the backfield of the football team. They had a place for him on the baseball team. He was a member of the track team. They sought him out, and he, of course, was very happy to go there. He had his time at Pasadena Junior College, and it was at UCLA where he first met Rachel, who was his wife for all of his, from 1945 until his death, early 1946 until his death. Kirkhoff Hall, for those of you who know the campus, they met just outside there. And he was kind of a big man on campus, and she was a strong-willed and lovely person who took them right away, and that's where it began in UCLA. So then I'm just seeing that there's a little bit. You have yes, so Jackie and Mac Robinson have those big busts. They're statues in Pasadena City. I have not actually seen them. I've of course seen pictures of them. So that was the question. Unfortunately, I have not seen them. I've heard about them. There was a pitching coach, Mike McDermott, who was with the Dodgers for a long time, who told me how he likes to go and sit there. I think they're in a green of some kind where you can sit near them or among them. And he's talked about how powerful that is. And they certainly were, if you look at their lives, so Mac Robinson, who Jackie's older brother, who I mentioned, he competed as an Olympian and finished second to Jesse Owens, but he lived a life, a perfectly good life, but he worked for the city. He worked as a janitor. He didn't have a life of fame or great wealth. There weren't a lot of opportunities. You look at the difference between him and obviously what the opportunity that Robinson got, and how thin that margin is if you didn't make it to the elite level as a paying athlete, or as an athlete who could be paid. So Jackie loved to come out to LA and see Mac. And it's interesting because Mac lived to be into his late 80s. Robinson died at 53. So he lost a lot of, he died way too early, to say the least. And if we'd had today's medical attention and knowledge for diabetes, he might have lived quite a bit longer.
So somebody is asking about the relationship between Jackie Robinson and Martin Luther King. Was that actually a relationship, or how did that start? And how did he assist with that?
Yes, it was a very important relationship, and Dr. King, and this is characteristic of his generosity, but there's also truth to it, has said he doesn't think he would have risen quite so quickly or been accepted quite as quickly without what Jackie Robinson had done on that platform. He referred to him as a sitter-inner before there were sit-ins, because of the groundwork he laid. Now remember when Robinson breaks in, Martin Luther King is an 18-year-old theological student who has never given a public speech. Nobody's heard of Martin Luther King when Jackie Robinson is forging his path in professional baseball. By the time that Robinson retires in 1956, in those 10 years, well, now we're deep into the Montgomery bus boycott. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what happened in that extraordinary decade in this country. And around Montgomery is when, of course, Dr. King knew who Robinson was, and Robinson knew, of course, who Dr. King was. And so they were in touch, and he came down and did some work with Dr. King in Montgomery. Then right after retiring, Robinson began to work for the NAACP. Now that was sometimes in competition with the SCLC, with Dr. King's group for fundraising dollars and for publicity, but obviously it was all one mission together. And they were extremely close. And Dr. King would had him, for example, there was some church burnings in Georgia, and Dr. King asked Robinson to sort of lead the reparation effort, the fundraising effort to get those churches back, and he worked with him closely there. At the Dream speech in 1963, Robinson's whole family went down there. Robinson spoke on the dais with Dr. King before the march, not at the time of the speech, but right before the march, and then sat right up front for that speech. They were extremely close. They wrote each other letters, you know, my dearest Martin, my dear Jackie. Robinson, later in Robinson's retirement, had these wonderful jazz concerts in their backyard in Stamford, Connecticut. And when I say they were jazz concerts, that means you could, you know, walk out of the John and bump into Ella Fitzgerald, or Dizzy Gillespie, or all the different people who were there. It was an A-list star of jazz performers raising money for the movement, sometimes to help jailed civil rights protesters or other people. And Dr. King came to that to sort of, you know, bestow his presence upon that. So they were really very close. And one other note about that friendship is Robinson, however close he was with you, I made that point, and I think you read that, Christine, that Robinson was, and this is something that sort of came clear to me while writing the book, he was extremely true to his own convictions, Robinson was, and his own contradiction, which means he wasn't necessarily always easy to pin down, and he didn't always go with the herd mentality. So Dr. King, for many reasons, was opposed to the Vietnam War, and brought up the point, among other things, you know, why are young Black men joining the effort and dying over there when we're still subjugated here at home, and spoke eloquently about that. Jackie Robinson disagreed with that. He supported the war. He tended to be sort of, in this area, conservative in terms of his allegiance to American military, U.S. priorities, defeating communism. Robinson was an anti-communist, and he kind of called out, he called out Dr. Martin Luther King in one of his columns. Robinson, in one of his columns, he had a syndicated newspaper column, and went right after him. And King got on the phone and called up Robinson, and they spoke, and it was all smoothed over. But it's an interesting thing that shows the force of his personality, because this was a good friend and somebody who he deeply, of course, deeply respected and admired, and knew that Dr. King was the key to the whole movement. So a lot of love there, and a lot of layers and depth in that friendship and relationship.
Thank you very much for that. Someone thought that perhaps he testified in front of the House of Representatives, but they're not really sure why he actually testified. Was that related to something with Dr. King?
No, that's another really good question. So that goes back to 1949. I do have the opportunity to cover this in the book. It does relate to what I was just talking about with the sort of anti-communist views of Robinson. So in 49, he was, of course, a player, and I talked about what an MVP player, very, very famous. And Paul Robeson, who had been a famous athlete and then a famous baritone singer, and was very active also in civil rights, made the comment that he didn't think Black Americans would go to fight a war against the Soviet Union, given how blacks were treated. There was still segregation throughout much of the country. This is in 1949, but that they were not treated in that way in the Soviet Union. And this was the time of the Red Scare, and the House Committee on Un-American Activities was in full force in Washington, D.C. And they seized upon that moment they wanted to discredit Robeson. And they recruited Robinson, who they knew was, who had said publicly that he disagreed with that he would indeed, even though Robinson had been subject to prejudice in the army, that he would go into the army. He would, of course, fight for his country. That's what he believed. And so they asked him to come down and testify. This was in the summer of 1949. And he spoke extremely eloquently about wanting to have African Americans wanting the same piece of the American dream as everybody else and access to everything, and said he was not an expert in politics or communism or any kind of ism, but he said that if a communist says it's not right the way blacks are treated, even if I don't agree with him as other political views, he's still right. I still agree with him there. That's true. And in just one paragraph out of about a 25 paragraph testimony, did Robinson go against Paul Robeson, and say, he's certainly not speaking for me, and I wouldn't agree with that. And that, of course, was the headline that was picked up. That was a little on the front of the New York Times and basically every newspaper. Robinson, refutes Robeson, and there's that headline. Then you go in and you open the whole paper, and there's 25 paragraphs of this wonderfully. Lester Granger was a civil rights writer and newspaper man who helped write that speech. So that was the testifying in Washington. And Robinson later said, he was still quite young then. I mean, he was 30, but he was really pretty new to the arena. And he never regretted his sentiments, but he did regret saying it in that setting at the House Committee of Un-American Activities, and he regretted that it had any sort of presented personal problems for Robeson, who he recognized in a larger sense, of course, of being part of a collective movement. They were both on the right side of the larger movement.
So tell us a little bit about his time in the Army. To be a second lieutenant, did he go to officers training school because he was a graduate from Pasadena City College? What division was he in?
I can't tell you the name of the division. I can say that he did do officer training, and I think that was in Fort Riley, and then he went to Fort Hood. I also will say that he was not getting promoted sort of properly, and was concerned about that there was sort of racial factors playing into that. And Joe Louis, the great boxer who was also in the Army, was in the same training camp, perhaps the same division. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that. As Robinson, and kind of intervened and said that this wasn't right, and helped Robinson gain his position as second lieutenant. So he left in 1945. Again, he didn't see combat, and he got honorable discharge. And that was really his time in the Army. He was, already a known athlete. They wanted him to play football on the Army team, but he did not want to do that. He wanted to protect his knees. He felt he didn't want to be subject to somebody taking a shot at him or suffering an injury that could really hurt his career. So he decided not to do that.
So in his baseball career, how many bases did he steal?
Oh, I think he's 135. I think. Don't hold me to it.
Is that a record?
Question.
It sounds like a record.
No, he's not. He was not. Later on, base stealing became much more of a commonplace thing. But it's a good thing you bring up, because he was an extremely fast and dynamic player, and he stole home 19 times. And for anybody who's watched baseball, you can imagine how hard it is to steal home, right? The pitcher is right there, just have to throw it there to get you. But he stole home 19 times. He was extremely dynamic as a base runner and very aggressive on the field. And that was a big reason why he was chosen by Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Dodgers, who went out and signed the first African-American player and signed Jackie Robinson. Because if you went to a ball game, if you were a baseball expert or you were going to your first game, he stood out, and not because of the color of his skin, but because of his activity on the field. He was extremely dynamic. He had the football players' moves. He could juke and jink his way around fielders, and it was a beautiful thing to see that here was a time when they were all white fielders, and he's out there making them all look a little foolish. For anybody out there, probably people have at some point in their life played a game called running bases, which is basically you need 3 kids, and you have one person here and one person there, and they each have a glove on and a ball, and somebody tried to run in between and get from base here, base there, without being tagged. And it was a big something they played all the time in the cities then and all over back in the 40s and 50s, and still to this day. And it's really, really tough. It's tough to get out of it. It's called being in a rundown. If you're the runner, somebody has to drop the ball, or pretty much you're going to get tagged. And that's true in the major leagues. When you get in that situation, it's called being in a pickle or being in a rundown, and you're pretty much done for. You're going to get tagged out. But not Jackie. When Jackie got in that situation, it was, and more than one player told me how it was the most exciting play in baseball to see Jackie Robinson in a rundown, in a pickle, because of his way, how elusive he was, how dynamic as a runner, and how he could get around the fielders. They would all, the Dodgers and Carl Erskine, who was also still alive, was very close with Robinson, a teammate of his with Brooklyn, told me that it was like watching a 12-year-old playing with 8-year-olds, Jackie being the 12-year-old. And you think about that difference in age of young ball players, so to speak, and what an advantage a 12-year-old would have over an 8-year-old. And it really puts into perspective what he felt Robinson was doing. And they would all come to the top step of the dugout, the Dodgers would, every time that happened with Jackie, to watch him and see what he would do. So yes, so it's good you bring up the base stealing. He was certainly one of the great base runners of his or any time, and changed the game in so many ways, of course, but changed the game with his speed as well.
So did he make a lot of home runs?
He did. He had power. He didn't hit. He wasn't a power hitter in the way of other ball players of his generation. Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Ralph Kiner, people like that. So he wasn't really a home run hitter, but he did have power, and he did hit some important home runs. There's no question. When I talk about how inspiring he was as a player, that is something that was certainly picked up on by fans, including young fans. And one of the people who I got to speak with and became a figure in the book was a man named Ira Glasser, his name may ring a bell to some of you. He was the head of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, for 25 years. Extremely important figure in civil rights in this country. And he was 9 years old in 1949 when Robinson was playing for the Dodgers. And he will tell you to this day that watching Jackie Robinson is what led him to lead the life that he lived, and led him into a career of civil rights. And he's not alone. There's a little cadre of civil rights lawyers, poverty lawyers from New York and from other parts of the country who were inspired in that way by Robinson, what he was doing. And Robinson spoke to them not by somebody speaking to them as I'm doing here, talking about it, or by learning about it in school, because he was the most wonderful baseball player. They just loved him. They didn't think it, because he's black or they loved him. and it created this a sort of an acceptance or an ignorance in a way, a kind ignorance in a sense of people being different. You think about 1949, what, you know, there may have been no more integrated place in the country than Ebbets Field, where the Dodgers played. Even in Brooklyn, which of course had no legalized segregation, but people lived in their own neighborhoods. If you were in a white Jewish neighborhood or an Italian neighborhood or an Irish neighborhood, you'd go through your whole life and go to school and never really interact with, certainly nothing like the wonderful ethnic variety that is in New York and in Brooklyn these days. And so to go to Ebbets Field and be you know, a young white boy next to an older white man, and you're cheering together. You're cheering for Jackie Robinson. You're also cheering for Wee Reese and Duke Snyder and all the Dodgers, and high five, or didn't high five so much, but embracing or slapping each other's back when something goes well, is incredibly, incredibly powerful on a young person.
So when you watch the movie 42, I think that's the correct title.
Yes.
You see actually where Branch Rickey talks with Jackie Robinson about how he's going to have to learn to take everything from all the white people. Is it true that it was really difficult for him? And then what actually happened when he came out to LA? Because Walter O'Malley brought him out to LA, and then he didn't go with the Dodgers, didn't move to San Francisco. Wasn't there some...
I'll answer both of those questions. So, and I see there's also a question in the chat about that, his sort of having to take it or turn the other cheek. So that's accurate. And that is what Branch Rickey asked him to do that. And Robinson also saw it as the right choice. You know, he had an opportunity to say, no, I can't do that. But he did for the first couple of years. Nobody in baseball was hit with a pitch more often than Jackie Robinson in 1947 and 1948, his first 2 years in the major leagues. And that's not by accident. There were a lot of people who were coming after him. And when he would be hit by a pitch, he'd just simply get up and brush himself off and run to first base. He would get spiked by opposing players. He would hear things from opposing players that nobody would ever want to repeat. And yes, indeed, he did accept it. Well, not accept it, I should say, but he did not respond. He took it for 2 seasons. And then before the 1949 season, this is another reason why it was such an interesting year for me to write about and think about. Before that year, he went to Rickey and he said, I'm not doing it anymore. By now, he was an established player. And he said to reporters in that spring, they better be rough on me because I'm going to be rough on them. And that was the year in 1949 when he went from being a very good baseball player, he'd won Rookie of the Year and he was a solid player, but to being this great, as I mentioned, the best player in baseball, much more aggressive style. Jackie, towards the end of his career, he would holler out at you. He was tough to play against. Opponents didn't like playing against him because he beat you. And he was tough at doing it. So, it's partially true, and it's accurate in the movie 42 that in those years that he had to sort of turn the other cheek. But that's only a small part of what Robinson then became and did. And the more aggressive Robinson, incidentally, is what you saw in his brief time in the Negro League. He played for Kansas City, and they would say he was up to his neck in every game because he was so competitive. And involved. As far as LA, he never did come out to the Dodgers. Walter O'Malley traded Jackie Robinson after the 1956 season to the New York Giants. At the time of the trade, Robinson had already taken a job working for Chock full of Nuts. He'd taken a sort of executive VP type job, where incidentally shows you how times have changed. He made the same salary at Chock full of Nuts as he was making as a Dodgers major league player, Dodgers player. So he never came out with LA to LA, and he had a strained relationship with Walter O'Malley. Walter O'Malley kind of resented all the credit that Branch Rickey got Walter O'Malley was very progressive on civil rights and completely on the right side of it, but it was Ricky who went out and put his neck out and made it happen. And Walter O'Malley was always a little bit jealous. They were both men with big egos, and never thought he used to call Robinson a Ricky man. And after O'Malley had forced Branch Rickey from the Dodgers, it was never a fully warm relationship, but it worked. And Kay O'Malley, who was the wife of Walter O'Malley, had a good relationship with Rachel, Jackie's wife, and they certainly got along fine. But it was strained, and it was part of why it wasn't until Peter O'Malley took over for the Dodgers that Robinson sort of came back and engaged with the team. I see there's a question about Wee Reese as a figure in Jackie's story and journey. So there's a scene. Wee Reese was from Louisville, Kentucky, which is just south of Cincinnati. And so yes, he was a Southerner and was very important. There's a scene in 42 where Jackie's hearing a lot of hostile things from the crowd on the field during a road game in Cincinnati, and Wee Reese comes over and embraces him on the field. Now, it's unlikely that ever actually happened like that. It's a little bit of cinematic license, and the story's been told. Rachel once said to me that, there's a statue of that moment in Brooklyn. And Rachel said she was happy to have a statue, but she thought it was an exaggeration. They were making a heroic gesture out of something that was just an act of friendship. They would touch hands on the field. They were teammates. And Reese, it doesn't seem to be any indication Reese was making a theatrical stand of any kind, but he was the captain of the Dodgers, Wee Reese. Robinson loved Pee Wee, and they were great friends. And there's no question that Reese's friendship, camaraderie, togetherness with Jackie Robinson went a long way to the public perception, and also to Robinson feeling comfortable on the team. Reese, again, he was really the leader of that team. It was Robinson's team in some sense because he was the best ball player and he attracted the most attention. Of course, you'd have every week there'd be two piles of mail, one little hill of mail here for the Dodgers, and then a giant mountain of mail for Jackie Robinson. So in many ways it was Jackie's team, but in the inner workings of the team, Reese really helped run things. And so that relationship was exceedingly important.
So I see that somebody wants to know, did you ever meet and talk with Doris Kearns writing the book?
Now I do know, I don't know Doris Kearns Goodwin very well, but I have met her on a couple of occasions. I did not talk with her much for this book. I have certainly read her writing on the Dodgers and what I was describing about Ira Glasser. She had similar experiences as a young girl growing up in New York. So she definitely had some wonderful perspective on the Dodgers, but was not a source for me in this book.
So tell us a little bit about the foundations. There's a foundation in Stamford, Connecticut, and isn't there another one?
Well, the base is it began in Stamford, Connecticut. It's now based in New York City. And the Jackie Robinson Foundation, which was started by Rachel in 1973, just after Jackie had died, and a year before Jackie died, their son, Jackie Jr., died. So a time, I mentioned that just because a time of enormous grief, as you can imagine, in Rachel's life. And they began the Jackie Robinson Foundation with the idea that they wanted to provide education, access to education for minorities. And crucially, not just scholarship money, which was part of it, but mentorship, which they did from the very beginning, when they first, and this is part of what I wrote about in my Sports Illustrated story, but from their very first student to today, when they have 1,500 scholars, students go through the foundation. And they gave this mentorship, and they have a graduation rate of 98%, because early on they recognized that they couldn't just give money and then say, see ya. They had to provide some kind of a mechanism to help kids along, especially kids sometimes who came or largely came from disadvantaged backgrounds. Very, very important foundation, and has stayed true to that mission of education. Throughout the years, there have been people on the board that wanted Rachel to get involved in civil rights issues, whether within baseball to agitate for more Black representation or just in society at large. And she said, no, we're going to do education, and we're going to do that as well as we can. And they've done extremely well. The Nicole Whiteman, who runs the Los Angeles Dodgers Foundation out here for the Dodgers, another wonderful group, is a graduate of she was a Jackie Robinson Foundation scholar. That's why how she was able to go to school. She was mentored by Rachel Robinson and close with many of the people in the family. And she's giving back in that way. And she had this great job. There's lots of people throughout the community, not just in the philanthropic community, but in the business world, in the science world, in the entertainment world, who really blossomed through the Jackie Robinson Foundation.
Oh, that's absolutely fabulous. Wonderful. So also in your book, you present a wonderful bibliography of books for people to read further. Did you use all of them in your research when you
yes, and I was fearful that I might have left some out, because I would sort of gather information wherever I could, but I certainly read as much as I could, not only about Robinson, but about that time in America, to really try to understand the context that he was in, because as I alluded to, we're seeing not only 4 distinct periods in Robinson's life, but certainly 4 distinct periods in this country. And it was interesting, when he died in 72, and for those close to him, it wasn't such a shock, because he had been failing his health. He could no longer see very well. The diabetes was a serious concern, circulation issues. It was not a total shock. Of course, it was a shock, but they could see his health was failing. For people in the larger world, Jackie Robinson was 53. It felt like, we'd just seen him. He was a young man to be dying, so it was quite a shock. And it wasn't quite clear what the response would be, because he hadn't been, the movement had taken on, had obviously Martin Luther King, who had been assassinated, and Malcolm X, who was somebody who Robinson feuded with. He feuded with Adam Clayton Powell, who is an extremely important figure in Harlem, which is where Robinson's funeral was held. And so there was some uncertainty exactly how he would be received. And the turnout at the church was overwhelming, the number of people who came, and Jesse Jackson gave the eulogy and Roberta Flack performed. And then when they came out and left the church, again, it wasn't clear what, one person who was a young scholar, sort of civil rights scholar at that point, said, well, I thought of him as my father's hero. But when they came out on the street and began to leave Riverside Church in Harlem, there were people along 125th Street, thousands and thousands of people lined up along the street, gathered by the bridge, waiting at the funeral, waiting at the cemetery for him. The importance that he represented, it was in those years, and what it meant between 1947, when he broke in to the major leagues, and 1972 when he died, was really apparent that day, and the impact that he's had has continued since then. But he never really left us.
That's wonderful. So what a fascinating program, and we thank you so much for spending your time with us. We have a copy of this wonderful book, True: The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. It's available at Pasadena Public Library. You can also purchase it from Vroman's Bookstore in Pasadena, and I encourage you to get it and read it, because it's absolutely wonderful, and it sheds a new light on his career and his life. And we thank you very much. You want to end and tell us a little bit about Cooperstown and what you're going to do, and what you're going to the museum tomorrow?
Sure. Well, first, I want to just thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be there and to be in a place that's so important in Robinson's history. And thank you for all of you who contributed such good questions in the chat. I appreciate the opportunity. Yes, so I'm going to the Hall of Fame tomorrow to do a program on True. They have an author series, so I'll be in an auditorium and fielding questions as best I can there as well. So it's a special place for those who have never been here. It's not a place to miss. It's a wonderful environment. It's full of course, baseball history, but you feel like it's full of just history in general, and very accessible, very easy to get to, and a lovely place. So I encourage everybody to come, and I'll keep this nice evening in mind as I set out to the museum tomorrow.
Thank you very much. I'm sure your presentation was going to be wonderful tomorrow, as wonderful as it was today. And so thank you very much for speaking Pasadena Public Library today. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody. Good night.